Psychological experiments, while revealing, often tread the fine line between enlightenment and manipulation. Venturing into the controlled chaos of the mind, they expose the fragile underpinnings of our behaviors and emotions. These investigations, at times, unearth unsettling truths about human nature. And through their dark revelations, we confront the depths and shadows of our own psyche. And today, we're going to start going over a few more from the psychological experiments Iceberg. So if you haven't checked out the first couple of episodes, I'll put the whole playlist somewhere around on the page. I think this is the 6th actual tier, but we have one more episode left after this, and then this iceberg is done. The vertical chamber, or pit of despair, was a device used in experiments conducted on rhesus monkeys during the 1970s by American psychologist Harry Harlow and his students at the University of Wisconsin. The aim of the research was to produce an animal model of human clinical depression. Basically, they wanted to see if animals and humans, suffer depression the same exact way. The vertical chamber was little more than a stainless steel trough with sides that sloped to a rounded bottom. A 3.5-inch wire mesh floor 1 inch above the bottom of the chamber allowed waste material to drop through the drain and out of the holes drilled into the stainless steel. The chamber was equipped with a food box and a water bottle holder and was covered with a pyramid-like top. It was designed to discourage incarcerated subjects from hanging from the upper part of the chamber. Harlow's first experiments into the effects of loneliness involved isolating a monkey in a cage surrounded by steel walls with a small one-way mirror so the experimenters could look in, but the monkey would not be able to look out. The only connection the monkey had with the world was when the experimenters' hands changed his bedding and delivered fresh water and food. Baby monkeys were placed in these boxes soon after birth. 4 were left for 30 days, 4 for 6 months, and 4 were left in there for a whole year. After 30 days, the total isolates, as they were called, were found to be enormously disturbed. 2 of them refused to eat and starved themselves to death. After being isolated for a year, the monkeys were found initially to barely move, didn't explore or play, were incapable of having sexual relations. When put with other monkeys to play, in their daily session, they were badly bullied by the other monkeys as well. Basically, their entire personalities changed over the course of that 1 year, so much so that 2 of the 4 literally just refused to eat and died because of it. In order to find out how the isolates would parent, Harlow devised what he would call a rape rack, to which the female isolates were tied into the position taken by a normal female monkey in order to be impregnated. Artificial insemination had not been developed at the time, and he found that just as they were incapable of having sexual relations, they were also unable to parent their offspring, usually either abusing or neglecting them. Dude, this guy must have been some real type of messed up in the head. I don't even know where you come up with the idea we're just gonna have to tie these monkeys up and let these other monkeys go at them. Bro, what the fuck is wrong with people? I'm gonna read you his quote about that situation. He says, "Not even in our most devious dreams could we have designed a surrogate as evil as these real monkey mothers were. Having no social experience themselves, they were incapable of appropriate social interaction. One mother held her baby's face to the floor and chewed off his feet and fingers. Another crushed her baby's head. Most of them simply just ignored their offspring." These experiments showed Harlow what total and partial isolation did to developing monkeys. But he felt that he hadn't captured the essence of depression, which he believed was characterized by feelings of loneliness, helplessness, and a sense of being trapped or being sunk in a well of despair, as he said. The technical name for the new depression chamber was the vertical chamber apparatus, though Harlow himself liked to call it the pit of despair or well of despair, dungeon of despair, or the well of loneliness. Most of the monkeys placed inside it were at least 3 months old and had already bonded with others. The point of the experiment was to break those bonds in order to create the symptoms of depression. According to Harlow, most subjects typically assumed a hunched position in a corner of the bottom of the apparatus. One might presume at this point that they find their situation to be hopeless. Steve Suomi, one of Harlow's many doctoral students, placed some monkeys in the chamber for his PhD. He wrote that he could find no monkey who had any defense against it. Even the happiest monkeys came out damaged. He concluded that even a happy, normal childhood was no defense against depression. The experiments delivered what Deborah Bloom has called common sense results, that monkeys, very social animals in nature, when placed in isolation, emerge badly damaged, and that some don't recover and some just do. Gene Psaki of the University of Washington in Seattle and another of Harlow's doctoral students who went on to conduct additional deprivation studies told Bloom that in his view, the animal liberation movement in the US was born as a result of Harlow's experiments. But William Mason, another of Harlow's students who also continued deprivation experiments after leaving Wisconsin, told Bloom that Harlow kept this going to the point where it was clear to many people that the work was really violating ordinary sensibilities, that anybody with respect for life or people would find this offensive. It's as if he sat down and said, I'm only going to be around another 10 years. What I'd like to do is leave a great big mess behind. If that was his aim, then he did a perfect job. And that was words from William. So I think he's right, dude. That guy was messed up and he just wanted to leave a big mess. But anyways, moving on to the next one. Lauretta Bender was an American child neuropsychiatrist known for developing the Bender-Gisalt test, a psychological test designed to evaluate visual motor maturation in children. First published by Bender in 1938, the test became widely used for assessing children's neurological function and screening for developmental disorders. She performed research in the areas of autism spectrum disorders in children, suicide, and violence, and was one of the first researchers to suggest that mental disorders in children might have a neurological basis rather than attributing them to the child's bad behavior or poor upbringing. Because she was not trained as a psychologist, but rather as a medical doctor and psychiatrist, most of her work focused on diagnosing mental disorders in children. She also served as the head of the Children's Psychiatric Services at Bellevue Hospital for 21 years starting in 1934. In 1954, she testified at the Senate Subcommittee of Juvenile Delinquency hearings on the effects of crime and horror comic books as a medical expert for National Comics, which is now DC Comics, with a job as an advisor for the company. While conducting her research, Bender implemented several experimental procedures and she used many therapeutic methods. Some of these experiments and therapies, as well as her diagnosis, may be considered inaccurate and unethical by today's standards. However, the zeitgeist of the times was much different than that of today, and many of the procedures used by Bender were also being used by others around the same exact time. During the 1930s and the 1950s, when Bender was working at Bellevue Hospital, there was little knowledge in the realm of mental disorders. Many childhood psychiatric disorders were attributed to bad behavior or unsatisfactory upbringing. Bender was one of the first to propose that there was something neurologically impaired with these children. Bender diagnosed many children with childhood schizophrenia and sought to treat these patients. It is important to note that with more knowledge, clinicians today would most likely diagnose these children with developmental or behavioral disorders, not neurological disorders. In an attempt to treat those patients diagnosed with childhood schizophrenia, Bender employed electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT, after finding that the practice was successful in other applications. ECT was used in an experiment in Paris on children and adolescents in the 1940s and showed positive results. In 1947, Bender conducted ECT on 98 children diagnosed with schizophrenia under the age of 12, although only a few of the patients were considered to be in remission of schizophrenia. Bender considered the treatment overall beneficial to all but 2 or 3 of the patients. Bender considered art as an effective way to diagnose childhood disorders. She employed this technique to better understand the psyche of a child. A child's artwork was a medium in which a child could express their anxieties and aggression and allowed the clinician to gain insight into the child's mind. This belief was supported by several case studies, one of which was a study of a 6-year-old African-American female who was abandoned by her parents and later sent to Bellevue Hospital in 1943. The child expressed many feelings and past experiences in her artwork. Later, it was revealed through her art that she had been sexually abused before she was abandoned. After extensive art, talk, and dream interpretation sessions, the child was placed into a foster home and was considered to make an impressive recovery. In another study, the body image of schizophrenic children following electroshock therapy, Bender incorporated ECT and a child's self-image. This study used 15 schizophrenic children over the age of 6. The children were asked to draw portraits of themselves before ECT, immediately after ECT, and 15 minutes after ECT. The children were exposed to ECT every day for a mean total of 20 treatments. After each treatment, the patients completed the visual motor Gisalt performance test. Patients were followed up after the treatments have ended, and it was observed that the children became more anxious after the treatments had ended. And this was reflected in their drawings, which became more primitive after each ECT treatment. Verbal body image distortions also occurred well after the ECT treatments for that day. Basically, that did not help them at all. They got even more anxious. In an attempt to alleviate schizophrenic symptoms in children, Bender also used lysergic acid dimethylate, or LSD, and many psychiatrists at this time were experimenting with LSD as a way to treat schizophrenia, as there was no psychotropic medications invented at this point in time. Another example of controversial treatments for schizophrenia during the same time was called insulin shock and metrazole treatments. Patients were given large amounts of insulin in order to induce insulin shock, then giving metrazole in order to induce epileptic seizures, basically. The use of ECT and psychiatric treatment became less and less after the invention of psychotropic medications basically became a thing, which is good, because I don't know how much people would like to be getting shocked nowadays. So we're also going to go over the Bender-Gestalt test. This test began as being called the Visual Motor Gestalt test and was published in 1938. The basis of this test is that the world as a whole and what we perceive it are made up of many smaller parts that are not immediately recognized when experiencing the entire thing altogether. The test was developed by Bender to evaluate maturation of children aged 4 to 11 and measured how children responded to the stimuli as a whole. The principles measured in this test are vortical movement, biology determined in optic field, given rises to the most primitive visually perceived forms such as circles and loops. The next part of this test that comes up is movement. Always present is directional, clockwise or counterclockwise, or on a horizontal plane. Dextrad or syntrad. By controlling and inhibiting this action pattern, globes, circles, and arcs are constructed. This organizes the visual field into foreground and background. Boundaries between objects are delineated. Verticalization arises concurrent with body image maturation as the postural marginal shifts an infant to prone to the upright position, cross lines, diagonal or slanted relations, and angle formations at a later level of maturation, usually occurring at about 6 to 8 years of age. Bender believed that the lower age or more primitive abilities were signs of childhood schizophrenia, brain damage, or learning disabilities. All that jumble of whatever I just said, it was all just basically a test to see if you had any type of mental disabilities, schizophrenia, or anything while you were still young, so they could try to treat you or do whatever they were going to do with you. Anyways, that just kind of broke my brain at the end right there, so we're going to the next part. The monkey drug trials. In 1969, an animal experiment was conducted for the purpose of watching the effects of drug use and addiction take place. The experiment was looking to see whether monkeys would become addicted to drugs as a result of administering drugs to themselves in order to continue their drug abuse. Basically, if we give them drugs at first, would they continue to use them and actually feed their addiction, if that makes any sense. First, the monkeys were injected with cocaine, morphine, and amphetamines, and after, researchers began observing their behavior. After the monkeys were taught how to abuse the drugs, so after the monkeys were left alone, they were just left with the supply of drugs. And as a result, the monkeys became dependent on the drugs and became a danger to themselves and eventually just died. Researchers found that many biological traits of the monkeys were similar to humans. The results suggested that one of the main reasons for drug abuse is psychological dependence. This experiment was very unethical and cruel because they caused distress to the animals, and the monkeys suffered from pain, withdrawals, and eventually death. The monkey trials also lacked ecological validity because the animals did not have the capability of using drugs in the outside world unless they are trained on how to do so by people. The experiments are also non-beneficial because other than finding out that human behavior in monkeys with drug abuse is similar, it does not justify basically us making these animals into drug addicts, if that makes sense. All that to say that those people were scumbags, and I forget what iceberg I did before, but there's an entire island where a bunch of researchers, I'm not sure, I doubt it's the same exact ones, but they actually sent the monkeys from certain drug trials to this island, and they're basically super violent, they're very territorial. They still can't get drugs nowadays, but yeah, they basically left them on an old island. If I can find out which episode, I'll kind of link it right here, but anyways, we're on to the last part of this tier. Mouse Utopia. Officially, the colony was called the Morality Inhibiting Environment for Mice. Unofficially, it was called Mouse Heaven. Biologist John Calhoun built the colony at the National Institute of Mental Health in Maryland in 1968. It's a large pen, 4.5 foot cube with everything a mouse could ever desire. A bunch of food and water, a perfect climate, reams of paper to make a bunch of nests, 256 different apartments accessible by mesh tubes bolted to the walls. Calhoun also screened the mice to eliminate disease. Free from predators and other worries, a mouse could theoretically live to an extraordinarily old age in there without a single worry. But the thing is, this wasn't Calhoun's first rodent utopia. This was the 25th iteration, and by this point he knew how quickly Mouse Heaven deteriorates into Mouse Hell. After earning his PhD in zoology, he joined the Rodent Ecology Project in Baltimore in 1946, whose purpose was to eliminate rodent pests in cities. The project had limited success, partly because no one could figure out what aspects of rodent behavior, lifestyle, or biology to target. Calhoun set up his first utopia involving Norway rats in the woods behind his house to monitor rodents over time and figure out what factors drove their population growth. Eventually, Calhoun grew fascinated with the rodent behavior for its own sake and began crafting ever more elaborate and carefully controlled environments. It wasn't just the behavior of the rats that interested him. Architects and civil engineers at the time were having vigorous debates on how to build better cities, and Calhoun imagined urban design might be studied in rodents first and then extrapolated into human beings, basically our society. Calhoun's most famous utopia, number 25, began in July 1968, where he introduced 8 albino mice into the 4.5-foot cube. Following an adjustment period, the first pups were born 3.5 months later, and the population doubled every 55 days afterwards. Eventually, this torrid growth slowed, but the population continued to climb, peaking at 2,200 mice during the 19th month. Those mice were fucking. The robust growth masked some serious problems, however. In the wild, infant mortality among mice was high, as most juveniles got eaten by predators or perished from diseases or the cold. In Mouse Utopia, juveniles rarely died. As a result, there were far more youngsters than normal, which introduced several difficulties. Rodents have social hierarchies, with dominant alpha males controlling harems of females. Alphas also establish dominance by fighting, wrestling, and biting any challengers. Normally, a mouse that loses a fight would scurry off into some distant new place and start over again. But in Mouse Utopia, the losing mice couldn't escape. Calhoun called them dropouts, and because so few juveniles died, huge hordes of dropouts would gather in the center of the pen. They were full of cuts and ugly scars, and ever so often, huge brawls would break out. Vicious free-for-alls, all biting and clawing, and served no obvious purpose. It was just senseless violence. In earlier utopias involving rats, some dropouts turned to cannibalism, basically started eating each other. Alpha males struggled too. They kept their harems in private apartments, which they had to defend from challengers. But given how many mice survived to adulthood, there were always a dozen hotshots ready to fight. The alphas soon grew exhausted, and some stopped defending their apartments altogether. As a result, apartments with nursing females were regularly invaded by rogue males. The mothers fought back, but often to the detriment of their young. Many stressed out mothers booted their pups from the nest early before the pups were even ready. A few even attacked their own young amid the violence and abandoned them while fleeing to different apartments, leaving the pups to die of neglect, basically. Eventually, more deviant behavior emerged. Mice who had been raised improperly or kicked out of the nest early often failed to develop healthy social bonds, and therefore struggled in adulthood with social interactions. Females began isolating themselves like hermits in empty apartments. Unusual behavior among mice, male-adjusted males meanwhile took to grooming all day, preening and licking themselves hour after hour. Calhoun called them the beautiful ones, and yet even their obsession over their appearances, these males had zero interest in courting females, zero interest in sex in general. Intriguingly, Calhoun noticed that in earlier utopias that such male-adjusted behavior could spread like a contagion from mouse to mouse. He dubbed this phenomenon the behavioral sink. Between the lack of sex, which lowered the birth rates, and the inability to raise pups properly, which sharply increased infant mortality, the population of Utopia 25 began to plummet. By the 21st month, newborn pups rarely survived more than a few days. Soon, new births stopped altogether. Older mice lingered for a while, hiding like hermits or grooming all day, but eventually they died out as well. By spring 1973, less than 5 years after the experiment started, the population had crashed from 2,200 mice to 0. Mouse heaven had gone extinct. Utopia 25 ended half a century ago, but it continues to fascinate people today, especially as the gloomy metaphor for human society. Calhoun actively encouraged such speculation, once writing, "I shall largely speak of mice, but my thoughts are on man." As early as 1968, journalist Tom Wolfe titled an essay about New York called "Old Rotten Gotham, Sliding Down into the Behavioral Sink." Oddly though, none of the prognosticators could agree on the main lesson of Utopia 25. And also, down the rabbit hole, I forget the actual channel's name, I'm like terrible right now, but he made a good video on Utopia 25 and that whole backstory, so if I can, I'll try to link it down below somewhere, or if I can put a card in, I'll put it right up here. So either way, if you're interested in that, go check that out. And yeah, if you haven't seen the rest of the episodes, make sure you go check those out. I'll put that somewhere too. And we got one more episode left. We're at the final tier after this video, so hopefully that'll come soon. I've just been kind of slacking on this, to be honest. I thought I already finished it, but hey, I remember now, so we'll get to it. Hopefully a week after I drop this one, that one will come out. So anyways, stay safe, stay dangerous. Make sure you like, subscribe, all the YouTube stuff so they like me. And yeah, that's about it. Stay safe, stay laid, or get laid. Anyways, I'll see you later.